Craig held the report like it was a prop in some cheap comedy routine. He read out a line about the forklift maintenance schedule, paused, and smirked as if he'd just delivered a punchline. A few of the senior staff laughed under their breath. Others stared at the table, pretending to read notes. The words landed harder than the chuckles. Weeks of gathering data, cross-checking logs, and filing hazard notices shrunk down to a joke in front of the very people responsible for fixing the issues. There was a temptation to push back, to remind everyone in that room why the details mattered. But challenging him here would have turned the focus on me, not the facts. So I stayed silent. Let him think he'd turned the page on my concerns. Because while he was mocking that report, a copy with my signature was already secured in the hands of the ins. My name's Daniel, and for the past 20 years, I've worked in safety compliance across the industrial manufacturing sector. It's not the kind of job that makes headlines or wins company awards, but it's the kind that keeps people from getting hurt. My work has always been about the details, checking procedures twice, logging every inspection, and making sure small problems never grow into dangerous ones. Most days, you'd find me walking the floor with a clipboard, speaking with operators, or quietly reviewing incident reports in my office. I wasn't the loudest voice in meetings, but my colleagues knew that if I raised a concern, it was backed by evidence. That trust mattered to me. It was the invisible currency of my career. When Craig arrived as our new operations manager, I could tell from the first week that we worked from different playbooks. He liked fast rollouts and visible wins changes you could photograph for the company newsletter. My kind of work didn't fit neatly into a photo op. Before he joined, the leadership team valued my thoroughness. With Craig, it became an inconvenience, a roadblock to what he called momentum. Still, I kept to my routine. Procedures don't care about personalities, and neither do accidents. The work had to be done right, even if the person above me didn't see the point. PCTION board, waiting for its moment to matter. The first red flag wasn't dramatic. A pump motor overdue for service was marked monitor instead of repair, with a note about production priority. It happens sometimes. Parts are delayed, schedules slip, but the fix is usually rescheduled within a week. This one wasn't. 2 weeks later, the same note appeared again. Same handwriting, same justification. Then a safety drill disappeared from the calendar. No announcement, just a blank space where a quarterly exercise should have been. When I asked, Craig waved it off. "We just ran one," he said. We hadn't. The log showed 6 months since the last full drill. Near misses started to multiply small, almost forgettable if you weren't tracking patterns. A forklift clipped a pallet in a narrow aisle, scattering packaging across the floor. No injuries, no damage worth a claim. But the driver's report mentioned a blind corner made worse by stacked inventory, something I'd flagged a month earlier. The corrective action section was left blank. That was when the hazard report landed on Craig's desk. It wasn't a manifesto. Just dates, locations, photos, and a sequence of preventable risks tied to postponed maintenance and skip training. He skimmed the first page and set it down with a grin. "We've been running fine for years without this much paperwork," he said. "Let's not paralyze the shop with forms. Forms, that's what evidence becomes when someone wants it to. Matter less." Exclusion followed. Meeting invites that used to include my name stopped arriving. Work streams I'd helped design were now owned by people who didn't know why the steps existed. In a project review, Craig joked, "If Daniel had his way, we'd bubble wrap." The forklifts. A few polite laughs drifted around the room. The joke wasn't new. The willingness to laugh at it was. Memory has a way of lining up contrasts. Years earlier, after a compressed air incident, leadership had asked me to rework the lockout procedure. We rolled it out, audited it 6 months later, and incident rates dropped. Back then, Methodical didn't mean slow. It meant safer. Now, the same patients read as obstruction. Operators started coming to me in quiet moments, questions about whether a change was really okay, whether training would be rescheduled, whether the new shortcut on the line had been signed off. They weren't trying to stir trouble. They wanted to know if the rules still meant anything. I logged every conversation, noted times and names, and sent concise follow-ups. Documentation doesn't demand belief. It builds it. The near miss that finally could have been worse happened on a Friday. A forklift reversed into a lane flagged for pedestrian traffic, the horn barely audible over a line change. The spotter reacted fast. No one was hurt. The post-incident note recommended restoring an acoustic barrier we'd removed during a layout test at change. I had already requested be reversed. The barrier stayed off the plan. I escalated the report. Clean. Language, no adjectives, only the chain from decision to risk. It wasn't an accusation. It was cause and effect. Craig skimmed, leaned back, and said, "Let's not become the Department of No. People have work to do." What settled in me then wasn't anger. It was certainty. If the work couldn't earn respect in the room, it would earn it somewhere. That measured outcomes instead of optics. The meeting where he turned my report into a prop sealed it. He read a paragraph about the forklift maintenance intervals and smirked. "Overkill," he said, to the comfortable relief of people who wanted the conversation to end. Laughter came quiet and quick, the kind that tries to pretend it's harmless. I didn't defend myself. There was nothing to defend. The evidence didn't need a personality to carry it. It needed a witness and a place to be heard. So I let the moment pass, logged who laughed, and finished the day the same way I begin most of them, checking logs, tightening the trail, making sure every decision had a timestamp. The stakes hadn't changed. Human safety, legal compliance, and the integrity of a job that exists to prevent the problems no one wants to see. Craig wanted shortcuts. What he didn't understand yet was that shortcuts have a paper trail. And mine was already complete. The laughter faded faster than it started. Papers shuffled, chairs creaked, and the meeting moved on as if my report had been nothing more than a minor inconvenience. I kept my gaze steady on the table in front of me, making notes that had nothing to do with the conversation. Neutral expression, steady breathing, an old habit from years of compliance work. The more you let people think you're unbothered, the more freely they reveal themselves. Faces told their own stories. One supervisor smirked like he'd just scored points in a game. Two others avoided eye contact entirely. And then there were the few whose posture betrayed discomfort, eyes down, lips pressed, a stillness that suggested they understood more than they were willing to say out loud. No. One in that room knew that my silence wasn't surrender. The full safety report, the unedited version, with photographs, dates, and a timeline of postponed maintenance, had already left my desk weeks earlier. It was part of a scheduled regulatory review, something Craig either forgot about or never cared to understand. Every omission he'd brushed aside, every drill he'd canceled, every temporary safety measure that was never restored, it was all preserved, time-stamped and logged under my name. Craig believed that mocking me in front of the team had settled the matter. In his mind, he'd framed the conversation, made it clear that my overkill approach wouldn't set the tone here. What he didn't realize was that the conversation was no longer his to control. I didn't need to challenge him in that room. There was no value in turning the meeting into a debate he'd twist into another joke. Silence, in that moment, was leverage. It let him believe he'd closed the door when, in reality, he just walked straight toward the one he didn't know was open. The inspection date was on the calendar. The file was already in their hands. All I had to do was wait. The night after that meeting, the report became more than a document. It turned into a map. Every line needed a coordinate. Every. Claim a timestamp. If inspectors were going to follow it, the trail had to be clean enough to walk without questions. Email threads came first. A message from January 12th at 8:43 a.m. flagged a hydraulic seep on press. 4. The maintenance queue marked it non-critical monitor. 2 weeks later, January 26th, the same press bled fluid onto the safety mat. The mat was replaced. The leak. Still monitor. Screenshots went into a folder labeled by date and system. No adjectives. Just subject lines, senders, and responses. Maintenance logs told their own story. On February 2nd, Forklift 3B failed its horn test during the pre-shift checklist. The operator wrote, "Horn inop request repair." The work order opened that morning and closed the same day with the note, "Parts on order unit serviceable." It stayed in circulation 18 days. I attached a photo from February 14th showing the steering wheel with an X of blue painter's tape over the horn button. The driver had put the tape there to remind himself to ride the brake on blind. Corners. Training records filled the next gap. A quarterly evacuation drill scheduled for March 12th was marked postponed staffing constraints. No reschedule date. The column under drill complete remained blank through April. A memo from me, March 19th, recommended a tabletop drill as an interim step. The reply came back, revisit Q3. Photographs added weight. On March 28th, I shot a series of images of the pallet racking on aisle 7 after a collision. Upright guards were missing, beams bowed enough to catch the eye. A temporary chain closed the lane, then disappeared within 2 shifts. 2 days later, the rack carried full load. The images sat next to purchase orders, showing replacement guards marked deferred. None of this went into a speech. It went into a binder tabs by system, then by date. Each tab had a 1-page index, so an inspector could land on a point and see the chain forward and back. I called a contact at the regulatory board, someone I'd met during an industry walkthrough 2 years ago. Her name is Lila. We stay careful. No shop talk that crosses lines. I asked only 2 things: verify the inspection window and confirm the scope. She paused long enough to choose her words. The site is on our list for a compliance intensive review, she said. Window is the second half of May. Bring your documentation. Let the process work. That phrase, "let the process work," sat with me. It's the quietest kind of confidence. Around the same time, rumors started rising through the mezzanine. Craig had been telling the VP that the new safety culture is softening. People are less afraid to work. The phrasing tried to make known compliance sound like maturity. It also telegraphed the argument he planned to use when numbers didn't go his way. Not negligence, philosophy. I stopped correcting hallway narratives. Correction turns into debate. Evidence turns into outcome. A few allies still cared about the line between faster and unsafe. Priya from Quality sent me a note on April 3rd with 3 out of tolerance readings on the guards for the press break. The readings weren't catastrophic, but they were outside spec. Her email ended with, "logged in QMS, no corrective action assigned." I added her data to the binder and printed the QMS screen with the TIMES.Miguel, one of the shift leads. Brought a small stack of operator checklists from his crew. He didn't editorialize. He pointed to repeated notations: mirror loose, floor paint faded, strobe intermittent, and the column for action taken sitting empty. For days at a time. "If they ask, I'll answer," he said. "I just want it written somewhere real." I scanned every sheet and handed the originals back. By mid-April, the narrative had edges. January's leak, February's horn, March's drill, April's out of tolerance guard. Each choice on its own looked manageable. Together, they formed a slope. The slope pointed in one direction. I wrote a cover sheet for the binder. 1 page, 12 lines, no adjectives. It summarized the findings as sequences. Report gives acknowledgement, gives deferral, gives consequence. Under consequence, I never wrote injury. The truth was simpler and harder to dismiss. Elevated risk persists. Temptation to confront Craig eased as the structure sharpened. Speaking up in a room where the outcome is already chosen only feeds the performance. The inspection wouldn't be theater. It would be measurement. Upper management's posture grew clearer, too. The senior director forwarded me a note from Craig asking to streamline the incident coding to reduce noise. The suggestion buried near misses under a single label. I replied with 2 lines, our definitions, and the OSHA cross-reference. No debate. Just the standard and the citation number. One more passed through the floor, and the timeline closed. On April 21st, I watched a contractor install a replacement guard on aisle 7 with 2 bolts instead of 4. The work order called for 4. He shrugged. They said it's temporary. Temporary fixes are where permanent habits show themselves. I photographed the 2 bolts, captured the work order number, and printed the sequence together. None of. This made me feel vindicated. It made me ready. The goal wasn't to catch anyone. It was to keep a record honest enough that outcomes couldn't hide behind charisma. The last step was simple. I called Lila again, not to push, but to confirm I had my dates right. She didn't add detail. She didn't need to. Be available that week, she said, and keep your originals. We'll ask for copies. The binder went into a locked drawer. A second set of prints sat with legal. Digital copies lived on a drive with version history turned on. I stopped checking the calendar every hour. The work was finished. Craig could keep telling stories about a relaxed, confident shop. He could keep laughing at paragraphs he didn't write. The system would speak in the only language it trusts: time, evidence, signatures. And when that knock finally came, there would be no ambiguity about what had been neglected when it was flagged, and who chose to call it overkill. Once the inspection date narrowed to a single week, the work shifted from building the record to hardening it. Every file in the binder had a twin one on the shared drive with locked permissions. One on an encrypted USB that never left my desk drawer. Version histories were intact, every change traceable. No one could claim a document had been modified after the fact. I spent a weekend combing through my own internal notes. Some were scribbled margins on printed memos. Others lived in a plain text file I'd kept since my first month under Craig. I added timestamps to anything that lacked one, cross-referencing with emails or work orders to nail the dates. Each entry became a clean line. Event gives source, gives outcome. The less I wrote in adjectives, the stronger it read. Staff who had quietly followed procedure needed no coaching, but I made sure they had access to their own logs and training records. Just answer exactly what's asked, I told them. Nothing more, nothing less. It wasn't about rehearsing a story. It was about stripping away the room for spin. If someone asked whether a drill happened, the answer would be a date or the word no. I ran my own work through the same filter. Every recommendation I'd made in the past 6 months had a follow-up note, either implemented, deferred, or declined. When a measure was declined, the reason was documented in the decision-maker's own words. That way, any chain of accountability started and ended where it should. The thought of catching anyone didn't motivate me. The point was simpler. When inspectors opened their notepads, they would find a company either in compliance or not. My role was to make sure the truth couldn't be argued into something softer. I set contingencies in place. A second copy of the binder went to my home office, locked in a cabinet. A digital copy lived in my personal cloud storage encrypted, just in case access at work became restricted at the wrong moment. If someone tried to pull files from the drive, I'd still have the originals. 2 days before the inspection. Window. I walked the floor one last time, not to look for new violations, but to verify the corrections that had been claimed. A forklift horn had been repaired. The press brake guard now read within spec. The rack in aisle 7 still carried load without all its guards installed. It was enough to show that some issues weren't oversight. They were choice. There was a calm in knowing the preparation was complete. I wasn't chasing new leads. I wasn't drafting rebuttals. The next move didn't belong to me. Justice in these settings rarely looks dramatic. There's no scene where the villain is dragged out of the building. More often, it's a quiet shift, a finding in black and white, a recommendation for corrective action, a note in a file that follows a person longer than any argument. When the knock came, I wanted the inspectors to find more than a report. I wanted them to find a record built so cleanly that even those inclined to defend shortcuts would have to face the slope they'd been walking. It wasn't vengeance. It was clarity. And clarity, once it's in the file, stays there. The day started like any other Craig holding court near the coffee station, tossing out weekend stories as though the workday was just a stage for his personality. Then the front desk called to say there were 3 visitors from the compliance office waiting. By the time they stepped onto the floor, the mood shifted. Clipboards in hand, ID badges clipped neatly to their jackets. They weren't smiling or making small talk. Their lead inspector introduced herself, named the regulatory body, and asked if the operations manager was available. Craig was all warmth. In that first handshake, guiding them toward the conference room as if he'd been expecting them. 10 minutes later, that confidence had started to fray. I could hear the change in tone from my desk, a polite cadence giving way to shorter, more measured responses. When they emerged, one inspector held my safety report. Not the version Craig had skimmed weeks ago, but the full document, complete with incident logs, photographs, and cross-references. "Daniel," the lead said, motioning me over, "you're listed here as the primary reporting officer. We'd like to walk through a few points directly with you." Craig didn't speak, just gestured toward me with a tight smile. They started in the equipment bay, matching my photographs to the actual machines. "This guard still the original issue?" one asked, crouching to inspect the press brake. I confirmed the date it had been flagged, the work order submitted, and the response I'd received. No adjectives. No commentary. Just facts. Craig followed the group, his earlier swagger replaced with a silence that felt heavier by the hour. Each time an inspector posed a question tied to my notes missed drills, expired safety certifications, incomplete maintenance logs, he shifted his weight, glanced away, or busied himself with his phone. In the forklift area, one inspector compared the current setup to my hazard report from 3 months prior. "We see the corrective action here was marked as complete," she said, "but the floor markings are still missing." Craig muttered something about budget cycles, but they moved on without acknowledging it. Midday, the lead inspector asked if there was a private space to review documentation. Craig gestured to the conference room again, but she looked to me. "Daniel, you have your own workspace? We prefer to go over these where the files originated." I nodded and led them to my office, aware of Craig watching from the hallway. We spent the next hour going line by line. When they needed clarification, I provided it with dates and references. If I didn't recall a detail, I pulled the original document rather than speculate. That seemed to matter. They weren't here for opinion. Only the paper trail. By late afternoon, the questions had shifted from what happened here to was this escalated? And who signed off on this decision? More than once, my answer pointed to an email or memo bearing Craig's name. I didn't emphasize it. I didn't need to. Around 4:30, the lead inspector closed the binder and thanked me for my cooperation. "We'll be compiling our findings and issuing a formal report," she said, making deliberate eye contact. Craig stood a few feet away, his jaw set, his earlier attempts at casual authority gone. There was no dramatic scene, no raised voices. Just a man who had spent the day watching the system he'd dismissed methodically document his decisions. He excused himself before the inspectors left, mumbling about another call. Though everyone knew the calendar was clear-dot as the door shut behind them, I felt no surge of triumph, only the steady confirmation that the process had worked exactly as it should. The truth, once documented, doesn't need embellishment. It holds its own weight, and Craig, for the first time since he arrived, had nothing left to say. 3 months after that inspection, the place looked and felt different. The safety drills that had been quietly dropped were back on the calendar, executed to the letter. Maintenance logs no longer sat half-completed on someone's desk. They were filed, verified, and reviewed weekly. It wasn't perfection, but it was movement in the right direction. Craig was gone from the day-to-day, officially reassigned to a role that involved no operational oversight. The memo made it sound like a strategic shift, but everyone understood what it meant. In his absence, the atmosphere shifted. Meetings became shorter, more focused. Deadlines were realistic, and safety was no longer something discussed in the last 5 minutes. For me, the biggest change wasn't the procedures, it was the access. Upper management now had my direct line, bypassing layers that used to filter or distort what was happening on the floor. It wasn't about promotion or recognition. It was about clarity. Decisions could be made on facts, not personality. Some colleagues, the same ones who had looked down at their shoes during that meeting months earlier, stopped by my office to say they wished they'd spoken up sooner. I didn't hold it against them. Pressure makes people cautious, and not everyone is willing to risk being singled out. Others kept their distance, perhaps embarrassed by past smirks or silence. That didn't matter either. My respect for someone's work isn't based on whether they like me. It's based on whether they do their job. In quieter moments, I thought about that day when Craig mocked the report. It would have been easy to respond with anger or sarcasm to try to win the room back in that moment. But if I'd done that, I would have been arguing for myself, not for the truth. The inspection didn't need my outrage. It needed my preparation. That's the part that stuck with me. The facts didn't just speak. They dismantled the false confidence piece by piece, without me raising my voice. The system, slow as it can be, worked when it had the right information in front of it. And that's why I'd do it the same way again. Integrity isn't about always getting credit. It's about standing by the work, even when someone else tries to turn it into a punchline. It's about knowing that while noise fades quickly, records last. So, when I walk the floor now, checking a machine or signing off a log, I don't think about Craig or that meeting. I think about the fact that everyone here goes home safer because the process held. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that the most effective response to mockery isn't to match its volume, it's to outlast it with results. Facts don't flinch, and truth doesn't rush. It just waits for the right moment to be seen. If you've been in a similar situation, where patience and preparation turned the table, share it. You never know who might need the reminder that quiet work can still win.